Welcome to Take 16 of the Unedited series, where we strive to live more boldly, more courageously, to live a life that is unedited, where you show up as more of your authentic self in a world that applauds inauthentic expression and majority thinking. I'm your host, Rontiade Benson Idahosa. I'm a peacemaking light worker, a lover of justice, and on this episode, we are talking generational or ancestral trauma. And so perhaps the first place to start is with a working definition. And for me, it's always easier to define what generational trauma is not. Generational trauma is not a generational curse. And I'll say that again. Generational trauma is not a generational curse. And I emphasize that because in my context in Nigeria, that is the manner in which you hear a lot of people refer to it. This can range from anything from juju curses, right, voodoo curses that result in supposed demonic possession to hereditary bad luck. And most of that context stems from verses in the Bible where we supposedly hear God passing down the punishment of the sins of the parents from one generation to another. First of all, this begs the question of who you know God to be, right? What version of God do you choose to believe? Because the nature of the God that I know is not punitive, but one that is benevolent in love, gracious and forgiving, and is prodigal, right? Secondly, most of the people who actually believe in generational curses are the same people who profess faith in the finished work of Christ, right? Both of these things cannot be true. So which one is it? Many of us have inherited patterns, emotional, physical, even behavioral, right, that didn't begin with us, but have shaped our lives. The only great-grandmother I knew was my maternal great-grandmother. The only grandmother I knew was also my maternal grandmother. And both of my father's parents had transitioned by the time that I was born. But as a family historian, one of my favorite pastimes is literally to sit at the feet of my mother and ask questions about her life. And she will often tell me stories, parts of which I've weaved together to see patterns of behavior. You see, my mother didn't grow up in a family where they talked about pain. And so when it happened, she literally just absorbed it and she kept it moving. No processing. It just sat there in her body, being modeled over and over and over again for the next generation. And so I remember being very sensitive as a child. And when I would often come to my mother because I was being teased or bullied by my classmates, she would tell me to act like the older sister, and then, I would tell her, but Mom, this makes me want to cry. I actually want to cry. And she would say, okay, go to your step. Because I had a specific step on the staircase in our house. And I would go there and I would cry. That's what I would do. And so it's not until I became an adult that my relationship with my mother actually shifted. The more questions I asked, the more I began to understand her and look upon her lived experience with a level of compassion. And today our relationship is beautiful because when she knew better, she did better. But first, I had to become self-aware of that pattern because otherwise I would have repeated the same thing with my daughter. And so as you're listening to me, I want you to take a moment to reflect. Is anything coming up for you? What I'd like to do today in the time that we have left is to offer us a reframe, right? What if these aren't curses, but literally unprocessed wounds that were passed down through generations? And what if you are the one that's meant to end the cycle? You see, I double majored in psychology and sociology for my first degree in uni, and I remember studying this subject. There were so many different definitions of generational trauma, from the passing down of physiological and psychological emotional wounds from one generation to the next. Someone else defined it as a suffering experience by a previous generation that continues to negatively impact members of the same family. I use a simpler definition, and my definition is that generational trauma is simply unhealed or unresolved emotional pain that's passed down through families, often through behaviors, beliefs, and even epigenetics, right, which is the study of how trauma imprints on DNA. And so unlike a curse, which suggests punishment, generational trauma is simply unhealed pain that's seeking resolution. Because trauma is a real living force, right? It shares a symbiotic relationship with your soul, and until it is addressed, it consistently seeks a soul's audience and its own voice and validation. So, what does generational trauma look like in real life? There are two ways that it generally shows up: emotionally and biologically. Emotionally, it means that you're psychological patterns have been affected by what you learned. I gave one of my personal examples, and let me know if you recognize yourself in that one or in any of these that I'm about to describe. So maybe you have a scarcity mindset, a fear of lack that you got from your parents because you grew up in poverty, right? Or maybe your family keeps secrets and you guys don't talk, even if there has been visible oppression. Perhaps there's an emotional detachment from your parents who never showed you love because they were neglected and were never shown love. Or maybe there's a dysfunctional behavior in your family relationships where you see a mother, for example, that's abused, who abuses her daughter, and then the daughter goes on to either become an abuser herself or she chooses a partner that abuses her. On that latter point, I want to make a note here because we're sometimes drawn to people without really understanding why. And we will often mistake that as, wow, this feels like I've known you for all my life, or we bonded so quickly, or this feels so right. But the truth is that the pull to the other person may be because it is familiar and we're drawn to what we know. And so if that's abuse, that's what we will be drawn to. That's certainly something to be mindful of. Biologically, though, generational trauma can show up in your body because it has an impact on our DNA. It impacts how the DNA expresses itself. Trauma can impact the way our bodies regulate after stress, right? Fight or flight turns on and it just doesn't turn off. Our bodies remember. The body keeps the score, right? This is called epigenetic memory. And there was some research that was done in 2013 where mice were trained to smell a cherry blossom. And every time they did that, they were shocked with electricity. After 10 days, the mice became afraid of the scent because they started to associate that scent of the cherry blossom with the shock. They then took the sperm of the male mice that were shocked and impregnated female mice. The baby mice actually never met their father. Researchers then tested the offspring of the mice, and when they smelled cherry blossoms, they were scared, even though they didn't have the shock experience. Even the grandchildren of the mice that were shocked had a fear reaction when they smelled cherry blossoms, even without the experience. And so we carry these traumas in our bodies from our family. And my friend, Dr. Anita Phillips, says that their story is your story in your body. And so today I'd like to offer 5 ways to integrate and heal generational trauma. The first one is to recognize the pattern. Carl Jung would say, make the unconscious conscious. Observe repeating struggles, right, regarding financial instability or dysfunctional relationships or the fear of authority or suppressed emotions. And the question I want you to ask yourself here is, what cycles have I unconsciously inherited? One of the ways to do that is through shadow work, right? Journaling and meditation. These are things that may help bring these patterns to light. Another way is to have the humility to ask those within our trusted circles, those who guard your inner sanctuary. Do you see patterns from my parents that I'm repeating with my own children? You see, I am fortunate to have a daughter that would always respectfully call me out when she would see me acting in a way that revealed aspects of my unhealed self. And so that helped me move through all of this in a way that I was a lot more conscious of. The second thing is to reclaim your divine identity. You are not merely an extension of your ancestral wounds. You are a divine being with the power to transform them. During a recent conversation with my friend Chine, he asked me this question: how do you kill the God that is in you? You condition it with fear. And so whether it was your parents or other family members, when the child is conditioned with fear, they show up as a much smaller version of themselves. But he also asked me this: how do you raise a God? You condition it with love. And so again, for me, practices like meditation, prayer, and affirmations helps me become conscious, telling myself things like the cycle stops with me. And so I urge you, connect with your higher self and remember that the same way that your lineage can carry generational trauma, it can also carry generational wholeness, generational strength, and generational wisdom. The third thing I want you to be mindful of is that we have to embody new choices. Healing is not just knowing better, but choosing differently. You have to do the healing work. And three suggestions I'd like to make for you here is that number one, you can create conscious shifts, right, via conscious parenting. Practice emotional intelligence and open communication. If past generations suppress their feelings, be intentional about speaking. Teach your children how to name their emotions. Normalize conversations about feelings and uncomfortable subjects. As a Nigerian, there's still some things we just don't talk about with our parents, right? And I initially grew up like that with my own daughter. But once I recognized it, and again, she drew my attention to this, I made a conscious shift. There's absolutely nothing off limits today. And so I shared my lived experience with my daughter. I told her the truth of what my reality was, the mistakes I made, the things I wish I could have done differently. All of that was necessary because it helped to unravel shame. And so I want to urge you to create family cultures where vulnerability is not punitive. Another conscious shift is around the subject of money. How many of you heard that money doesn't grow on trees when you were growing up? For many of us, this created a scarcity-based belief, a scarcity mindset. Shift from these beliefs to teaching wealth-building habits, generosity, and financial responsibility. And finally, teach the next generation that they are divine beings with limitless potential, that they're not burdened by past limitations. How many of you are teaching your children these things? How many of you are teaching your children meditation and mindfulness to help them stay centered? Encourage a strong sense of self-worth, because small, intentional choices are what rewrite your lineage story. Number 4 is to have compassion for your ancestors, right? Many of them lack the tools, the resources, or the societal permission to actually heal. But to get to this perspective, you first have to do the inner work and heal yourself. Once you've done that inner work, and if your family member is available, able, and willing, and they have to be all three, Dr. Anita Phillips says that you then sit down and begin to ask questions. Ask questions. Let them tell you their story so that you can see how they got there. But this is key. Don't come with the expectation that they will apologize or validate your experience. Many of them won't. They don't even have the capacity to even process their own trauma, much less your own. And so the idea, she says, is to gather information so that you can see what you inherited and use it to empower your own healing process. From that lens, we can stop blaming them and instead offer compassion and honor their survival. There's a reason why they ended up the way that they did. And in Nigeria, we say, "It gets why." It gets why. There's a reason behind it. And so you may be thinking, well, that's great because, your parents may still be alive. But what if my parents have transitioned? Like my father passed away 24 years ago. And I remember at the time, there were things I wanted to say to him, but I couldn't because he was gone, right? And so you may be in that situation as well. But if your parents have transitioned and are not physically here to have that conversation, I believe you can still engage in ancestral healing through prayer, meditation, where you choose to release your pain, where you choose healing for all of us. Finally, I want to encourage us to cultivate a new legacy. What values do you want to pass down? I'm so grateful to my daughter who helps me understand that second chances are available to those who stumbled over her first. She was patient with me while I healed my own wounds. And so for me, I've chosen to give my daughter the gift of a God of love, not one of judgment or one who curses the beloved. Another value that I've chosen to pass down is the fact that she is a divine being, and that as such, she has the power within her own hands to correct even my own incidents of errant parenting. So what values are you passing down, or what values would you like to pass down? I invite you to reflect on that. And so whether or not you have children, your own healing actually shifts the energy of your lineage. So commit to being a vessel of light. Commit to modeling peace, self-worth, and conscious living. I want to remind us that healing is an act of courage. You are powerful enough to transform not just yourself, but generations before and after you. One of the affirmations I remind myself of often is that I'm the bridge between the past and the future. Divine healing flows consistently through me, and I walk in wholeness. And so I invite you to reflect, to share your thoughts, or to continue the conversation through life coaching with me if you feel that that's something that might be helpful to you. Those are my thoughts of the day. Do with them as you will. Blessings.